Hi guys, I hope you're all doing well and still keeping safe. So today's lesson is about culture and mental health, of which it's chapter 17 of SOK 110. I hope you guys will enjoy this session and learn more about culture and mental health. So yes, let's get rolling. I hope you guys are ready for this session. So, just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to look at culture and idioms of distress. Secondly, I'm going to look at culture, assessment, and diagnosis. Then, lastly, I'm going to focus on reflection on the themes. So, culture and idioms of distress. So, culture and idioms of let me say idioms of distress. So, idioms of distress are culturally and interpersonal effective ways of experiencing, expressing, and coping with distress. So it allows an individual to convey distress in a way that is recognized by their own culture. So therefore it differs across contexts, societies, cultures, and countries and individuals. Another definition of idioms of distress is that it's an alternative mode of expressing distress and indicates manifestation of distress in relation to personal and cultural meaning. So distress may arise from economical difficulties, personal conflicts, and also cultural conflicts. So it differs across cultures, context, because people experience, express, and they cope with their distress in different ways according to their own culture or the way that has been recognized by their own culture. So as I continue with idioms of distress, so as that they should not be restricted to mental illness. They are also an indicator of physical and psychological disorders, and they're a primary channel to communicate distress and social discontent. However, they vary across different cultures and they are constantly changing. I hope you guys will understand more as I continue with this. So behaviors that serve as idioms of distress. So these are just examples. So experiencing lower back pain. So experiencing lower back pain is closely associated with overworking or stressing. So when you experience lower back pain, people or your family may say that you have overworked yourself or your muscle or you are stressed. So you need to relax. So the second one is medicine taking. So taking medicine in front of your significant others, families, friends, colleagues, or partners may be interpreted as a performative act that alerts them that you are not okay or your condition has been altered. E.g., taking an aspirin signifies the presence of headache or stress. So they should immediately understand or be alerted that now you have limited capacity for productive work at that specific time. So maybe you can't be active, you can't be energized when you have a headache. So they will immediately understand that, maybe advise you to go rest or advise you to sit down and etc. So the third one would be the changes in consumption patterns. So a change in pattern of consumption may indicate that one is going through a lot, one is not coping, one is faced with a difficult time, e.g. consuming a lot of coffee. As you know, some people have hangovers on Monday, so they would consume a lot of coffee. So that's a change of pattern. Or others, maybe when they are stressed or under a lot of pressure at school or at work, then they would consume more alcohol, or others would take frequent cigarette breaks, smoking breaks. So changes of patterns indicates that one is actually going through a difficult time. So interpreting idioms, the first thing to understand is that the first thing to know is the importance of context. Context is important, because now idioms of distress, the way a person express or cope, or how they cope with distress, differs from one context to another. So it differs across contexts, and it differs across cultures, also across individuals. So it is important to take into consideration context. So idioms must be interpreted in terms of a specific group's norms and values relating to self-expression, emotions, and social relations. The second thing to know is that idioms of distress change over time. So idioms are representative of a particular culture in a specific period of time. As I've explained on the previous slide, that maybe taking medicine indicates that your condition has been altered for a specific time. However, that can change. And then the third thing to know is the globalization. So it's to understand how a local idiom transfers over time to include new elements from different cultures, like African cultures, including some elements from the Western cultures, and vice versa. So the illustration of the somatization as an idiom of distress. So people do not experience or express distress in the same way across society, as I have mentioned on the previous slides. So non-Western societies, for example, they may experience psychological distress as a somatic illness or physical complaint. For example, when they fall down. So let's say maybe they have depression. So when they have depression, they may not really have the word to say that they have depression. They may somatize the distress by saying, oh, maybe they have lower back pains, they have headaches, they have this and this. So it's because non-Western societies hold limited psychological concepts. So they express distress through somatic symptoms, like I have headache, maybe they have anxiety. Let's say maybe they're diagnosed, or they have anxiety, not really diagnosed, or they have anxiety, then they would say that they feel what, pains in their heart, they physical symptoms that are associated with anxiety. So with Western societies, they can express their distress in psychological terms. So with Western society, they psychologize their distress, and with non-Western societies, they somatize their distress. So with non-Western societies, they have the physical complaint, like I have headache, I'm shaking, my heart is painful, I have pains in the heart, or what. And then with Western societies, they can say, oh, I have depression, I have anxiety, and etc. So individuals, however, before I continue, one is not better than the other. It does not mean that non-Western societies, since they somatize their distress, they are less better than the Western societies who psychologize their terms. They are all equal, because now that's the way they have learned to express their distress. So they are all equal. So individuals express distress using idioms at their disposal, so that the appropriate social response is generated. So that is why they differ across contexts, because now when an individual wants to express how they feel at a certain point, they have to do it according to their culture, or in a way that is recognized by their culture, so that they can receive an appropriate social response. So somatic symptoms are now regarded as the most common clinical expression of emotional distress worldwide. So the second one is culture, assessment, and diagnosis. So there are blind spots for culture in assessments and diagnosis. So culture, according to DSM-5, refers to systems of knowledge, rules, concepts, practices that are learned and transmitted across generations. So people experience and express distress according to the way that they have been taught by their culture or the way that is recognized by their culture. So that means culture also contributes to an individual's life. So culture needs to be taken into consideration when doing an assessment or diagnosis of a patient. So with a blind spot for culture, it is when you're not recognizing the scope of culture in mental health assessments and diagnosis, because now you cannot adequately assess or diagnose a patient without taking into consideration culture, because culture plays a huge role on how a person experience or express distress. So all forms of distress are culturally shaped. So the scope of connection between culture and mental health should be recognized as much broader than the narrow scope expressed by DSM-5. This is to avoid blind spots that may lead to misdiagnosis that can consequently lead to mistreatment. So accounting for cultural differences and similarities in assessment and diagnosis. So the first one is avoid misdiagnosis. So to avoid misdiagnosis is important to distinguish between cultural concepts of distress and mental disorders, because failure to do that may lead to misjudging the severity of the problem or assign the wrong diagnosis. For example, unfamiliar spiritual explanations may be misinterpreted as psychosis. Because, for example, in some African cultures, schizophrenia or depression, they're not really seen as psychological problems, but then they can be explained using spiritual terms or using religion. So it is important to be able to distinguish between cultural concepts of distress and mental disorders in order to adequately assess and diagnose a patient. Then the second one is to obtain useful information. So by distinguishing between cultural concepts of distress and mental disorders, it helps to obtain useful information in adequately assessing and diagnosing a patient. Then the last one is to improve the therapeutic efficacy. So we have to acknowledge that culture influences the psychological mechanisms of disorder. The way depression or schizophrenia is seen in one culture, it's not the way it is explained or seen in another culture. So it is important to take that into consideration, to take the influence of culture into consideration when assessing and diagnosing. Active recognition of interactions between all cultures in mental health assessments and diagnosis. So cultural differences influence one another. They are not stagnant, they are dynamic. So the culture of assessments and diagnosis making interacts dynamically with other cultures. So DSM-5 subscribes to the dynamic interactions of cultures, that cultural differences, they actually influence one another. However, it is important to take into consideration the differences and diversity of cultural values, because it helps prevent cultural blind spots, as I've said on the previous slide, that it is important to take into consideration the differences and diversity of cultural values, of which will help in preventing cultural blind spots and help to adequately do an assessment and diagnose a patient. Also, actively recognize both culturally uniformity and diversity. So the third point is reflection on the chapters. So reflection on the chapter's themes. So cultural context. I think I spoke a lot. I said a lot about cultural context. However, normal, abnormal, and psychology cannot be studied adequately without considering the cultural context. So we cannot understand what is psychology or what is normal and abnormal without taking into consideration cultural context. So it is important to consider cultural context when you distinguish between what is normal and abnormal, because a behavior may be normal in an African culture, and then it can be abnormal in the Western culture. So it is important to take into consideration the cultural context when studying what is normal, abnormal, and what is psychology, because without that we cannot adequately gain sufficient information. So concepts of self and normal psychological function, they reflect the broader beliefs and values that exist in a cultural context. So as I've said on the previous slide, that depression and schizophrenia may be explained in religious or spiritual terms, because now people find expressions through a variety of items or of distress. So it does not, no one is better, no culture is better than the other. It does not mean that when the African or when the non-Western societies somatize their distress and when they are wrong, because now the Western societies psychologize their distress. No one is better than the other. And then the proper attention should be paid on how culture impacts the diagnosis and assessment. As I've said, that we cannot fully or we cannot adequately diagnose or assess a patient without taking into consideration. Thank you so much, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this session. So if you have more questions or comments, you are welcome to send an email or write on the discussion board on ClickUp. So yeah, have a lovely day, and yes, guys.